Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the later years of Alexander the Great in our continuing study of Between the Testaments. Now, when we speak of his later years, remember that Alexander is only going to live to be 33 years old, so it's not that much later. But we've already seen Alexander in his conquest going all the way across the Persian Empire from Macedonia to Egypt to Babylon. And then finally, we left off with him traveling now into India. The Greeks did not have a really good idea of the geography of India. They had this idea, okay, there's a place called India, and then past that is the end of the world, the ocean, whatever we call that ocean. They really had a hard time distinguishing, for example, their term for what we call the Indian Ocean. They called that the term that they call that referred to both the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean and just all the water in that direction. Um, Now, in India, he meets King Porus, and this is his most difficult battle yet. Against the Persians, he'd been outnumbered. I'm not sure that that was even the case with Porus, but they were on new terrain. They were facing things like the heavy rains of the monsoons. It was a very difficult time. He did win, and when King Porus was brought before him, Alexander asked, how do you wish to be treated?" And King Porus answered, "Well, like a king." And Alexander responded to that, like, "I defeated a king, but this king is now going to work for me." And he replaces him he places him back on his throne. But now Porus will be a vassal and perhaps a satrap to him. And Porus's allies have now become Alexander's allies. So they have won India, but now they find out that they've only won a little piece of India, that India is much bigger than they had ever imagined, and there are other kingdoms, quite a host of kingdoms, some of them quite a bit larger than that held by King Porus, far to the east. And now remember, India is a subcontinent. It's huge, and Alexander had heard that there's a river far to the east called the Ganges. In Greek, the Greeks who'd heard about this thought, well, maybe there's another big river in the world that we know, the Nile, and they thought that maybe the Ganges and the Nile are somehow connected, that one flows into the other or something like that. Of course, we know there's no connection; they're half a world apart. But they didn't know that. It gives us a measure of their lack of understanding of the geography, even of their world. Well, it's around this time that Alexander's horse, remember Bucephalus from a few classes ago, the horse that he had obtained as a child, and he hasn't been riding him into battle all this time, but he has been sort of his honored companion. And Bucephalus dies and is given a burial, and actually a city is named after him, planted and named after him here in India. It's also at this time when Alexander has heard of the Ganges and some of those other kingdoms far to the east, and he wants to go there. And his troops, I put here the mutiny at the Hyphasis. And that might be a little bit unfair. They're not actually going to mutiny and try to replace him, but they are going to have, maybe a better term would be a sit down strike, where they say, please, 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 we want to go home. We want to see our parents. We want to see our wives. We want to see our children. We've been on the go for, it's been roughly 10 years by now. And will you please take us home? And one story has it that he gets on a boat, and this is what Alexander would do. He'd lead, and then they would follow. And so he gets in a boat, and he sails to the other side of the river, and he waits there, and he waits there. And after 3 days, and the 3 days part is that's fielded in all of the stories. I'm not so sure about the river. It did take place by this river, but after 3 days, he finally comes back and he says, "Okay, I'm going to take you. I'm going to take you home." And so we will now. But to get there, first he's going to go south. And he's going to march down the Indus. That had been a tributary of the Indus. He marches down the Indus River to the sea, and there's more fighting all along the way. In fact, they come to the city of Multan, and they're going to lay siege to the city. And Alexander, as very often he would do, not every time, but he leads the charge over the city walls. And as he does so, as he jumps over the wall with several of his companions at his side, the ladder that they've used to climb to get up there collapses. And suddenly, for a short time, Alexander and several of his soldiers are there by themselves. And Alexander is shot in the chest with an arrow, a very serious wound, pierces one of his lungs. Um, and yeah, his troops finally, get over the wall with him, and they see that he's been severely injured. They think perhaps he's dead, and they just take out their rage on that city, and they just destroy everybody in the city. It's a slaughter. But he hasn't died. He's carefully removed, and he goes through a period of convalescence there nearby. He can't be moved very far. And he does, he's young and he's in good health, and so he recovers from this, although it does take some time and it takes its toll. So he has been wounded, but he does recover. And now they march down to the what we call the Indian Ocean. Remember, they don't have a clear distinction of exactly which way that goes. And he has a fleet of ships built, and he assigns one of his generals, Nearchus, to be its new admiral. So what we're going to do is Nearchus is going to sail along the coast, and of course they don't know exactly what the outlines of that coast, the contours of that coast. We know it, but they didn't. In fact, when they come to the Persian Gulf, they're going to wonder: do we sail this way, or do we continue around this area to our west? The what we call the Arabian Peninsula. Fortunately, they didn't do that. that would have. And then he sends another group. To the north, going back along the passes that had brought them into India, so going back through the Hindu Kush. That's sort of the long way around, but it's actually going to be, in some measures, the easier way around. Nearchus is going to run into some storms and into the monsoon season and diverse winds that actually halt him, and it's going to be slow going for a while for him. And then Alexander takes a third group going parallel to Nearchus's route, and the idea is that they will support each other. But the idea doesn't work out where Alexander gets far ahead. Monsoons don't necessarily stop you from marching, but they might the winds might stop these ships from sailing. So whereas they had planned to go jointly, it doesn't work out that way. Alexander finds himself going through the Gedrosian desert, a very harsh desert. It had been said there was a popular saying that when the gods had made the earth, the leftover scraps were here in the Gedrosian desert. And so they're marching through the desert, and they are suffering terribly because they are running out of food and water, and which the plan had been for the ships to supply that. And he sent some men on ahead, and a few of them find a little dried up spring. They manage to gather a little bit of water into a helmet and to bring it to him where he might drink, even if the rest of them can't. And in the presence of them all, he pours it out and he says, I will not drink until my men can drink with me. And on the one hand, you think, well, that's ungrateful. No, actually, he's saying, I'm going to suffer with my men. And that was, it gave them enough energy as though they had all had a drink. He does this and he's willing to suffer. That had always been his rule of leadership, that what my men do, I will do too. Where I go, they will go. As they suffer, I will suffer. And they were willing to follow him to the ends of the world for that reason. Of course, they did want to go home. And they do make it. Nearchus's ships finally make it as well. When he gets back to both Persepolis and also Susa, one of the things that he's going to do is he's trying to unify his empire. And so he gives great gifts to any of his people, mostly generals, captains, things like that, who will take a Persian wife. And he also is going to take a wife. She's actually going to be from one of the outlying sub areas, but he will marry a princess. Roxana is her name. And a great number of his Persian officers take great number of his Macedonian officers take these Persian wives. In many cases, after marrying them and maybe even having a few children, they abandon them and leave them behind. But not in every case. We know of some of those generals that actually continued to have that Persian wife, and so what would follow then would be a mixture of Greek and Persian, and that's what Alexander he was trying to break down the nationalistic walls and to make them as much as possible one people. The sum total, and this is a map, compliments of National Geographic, that just outlines the outline of the continental United States over top of the areas that Alexander had taken in his marches. And you just get I want you to get a sense of just how far they had gone in what a short time. Remember, they're walking. Well, in Clearchus's case, he's sailing, but still, that was a tremendous conquest of Alexander's empire. He comes now to Babylon, and he has plans. He's going to send a great many of his soldiers home. Of course, he's got some new replacements, and he's making a plan to go down into Arabia. And one story has it that he's heard of a place far off in Africa to the west called Carthage. I'm not sure if that's true, but he is making immediate plans to go into Arabia when he gets very sick. Was he poisoned? Was it his old wounds coming back? Was it just malaria? That can be debilitating. But he gets very sick and he is bedridden and his health goes down and down and down. And his soldiers gather around. They actually march by. They want to see if he's still alive. And his generals gather around and say, "To whom are you going to give your kingdom?" Remember, he has a wife, but and she's pregnant, but there's no child yet. To whom are you going to give your kingdom? And he whispers out, to the strongest, which will set the stage for the next step of what will happen after his death. But we'll look at that in a future class. Finally, I want to notice the legacy of Alexander that he leaves behind. There had been a great cultural interchange from east to west. That is, not only did Greek culture come east, but Persian culture made its way to west, and they influenced each other. This interchange took on a number of forms. Scientific learning was certainly a part of it. Of course, remember, one of his tutors had been Aristotle, the father of modern science, and that made its way east. But the Persians certainly had learning too that came the way of the Macedonians and the Greeks. Hellenization, and the word, remember, Helos was the ancient Greek word, actually still the modern Greek word for Greece. And so this Greek influence, that's what we mean by Hellenization. The Greek culture permeated. It didn't necessarily mean that everybody became Greek, but they were all influenced by certain Greek aspects of the Greek culture. And then finally, especially for our New Testament purposes, the Greek language became the common language now of the ancient world. So that you're going to have Alexander's generals who will go on to rule for many, in some cases, hundreds of years. And in all those areas, for example, Egypt and throughout the Middle East, the Greek language will be one of the key languages which now is going to be spoken. You say, well, there are several different dialects of Greek. There was the Attic and the Doric and the Ionian, but this is going to be the common Greek, what we call Koine, so that when it comes time for the New Testament to be written, it will be written not in Aramaic, not in Hebrew, it will be written in Greek.